I'm not talking about whatever was scheduled. So unfortunately, they couldn't make it. I actually would have loved to have heard that talk, but because there's been stuff that I've been kind of thinking about and working on, and I kind of had something that I could actually talk about, which is unspeakable passwords, or issues surrounding pronounceable passwords. We've all seen pronounceable password generators. Or is there anybody who hasn't seen a pronounceable password generator? Great. Okay. Now, pronounceable passwords are particularly interesting for me. So, a little background. I work for AgileBits, the makers of 1Password, a password manager. And one of our big issues is making sure that people have good master passwords. And so a password manager is great for having a whole bunch of passwords that you never have to memorize or know or even see, and these can be very strong, but a lot depends on your own master password. And so we're trying to figure out how to help people come up with better master passwords or use better master passwords. And in general, if we design things correctly, a person's password manager, but a person's master password is going to be the weak point in the security. If somebody gets a hold of the user's data, then it can be attacked by all of you password crackers. These things are things that need to be memorized. They need to be things that can be typed in, and they need to be able to be typed in on multiple devices. That is, not only on a full keyboard, but also on a mobile keyboard with a finger or a thumb. And of course, we want these things to be as strong as possible. Now, one thing that of course we use is slow hashing. We've been using PBKDF2 with HMAT SHA-512 to kind of slow down automated password guessing. But we're pleased to see that a successor to PBKDF2 is on the way. The password hashing competition has announced Argon 2 as the winner of the password hashing competition, and it is going through a lot of extensive tweaks and revisions at the moment, but should be finalized relatively soon, and then there should actually be a successor to PBKDF2, scrypt and bcrypt, that the community can universally recommend to web developers and to others. So that's a good thing. Basically, these things slow down the rate at which attackers can guess a password. But in our usage, we're using it solely for key derivation locally. We're not using your master password is never used to authenticate to a server. There's no communication with any server out there, and therefore one of the features that an optional feature of these password hashing schemes, sometimes called Pepper, is a secret salt-like thing, or Pepper, that is known only by the server and is not stored with the salt in the password hash. You know, it might be in a hardware device or something like that. So Pepper, which Argon calls K, is not an option for us. And so all of the actual secrets must come from the user in our case. And so we have no K mixed in with our argon. And this allows me to right now make an extremely obscure joke at this moment, which is older than the Earth itself. And I'll explain that in questions if people actually want to know. It's not really very funny, but I enjoyed it and had to put it in there. Who cares what you think? Okay. The big limit with these kinds of password hashing schemes is that the work that they add to the defender, the work that they add to the attacker is proportional to the work that they add to the defender. In normal crypto, if you double your key length, you're adding an enormous amount more work to the attacker. The defender may need to double the amount of work that they do, or maybe even square it based on, the key length. But the work that the attacker has to do when going from, let's say, a 56-bit key to a 112-bit key is absolutely enormous and just wipes them out. With something like these slow hashing schemes, the amount of work that the attacker has to do is proportional to the amount of work that the defender has to do. It's not normal crypto. And it actually means that as computing power increases, the kind of arms race between the attacker and the defender biases towards the attacker. So these things are useful. They work against very particular threats. But slow hashing, as much as I love Argon and what the password hashing competition has done, it does not solve our problem. Okay. Diceware. You probably don't know it under that name. That's correct horse battery staple. The picking words absolutely randomly from a word list. This notion goes back a long time. ST is probably in the early 80s, probably the early instance that I know of. It was reinvented in 1995 by our old Reinhold, Diceware. I kind of helped repopularize it 4 years ago. That got picked up by XKCD, but these schemes where you've got a fixed word list and you pick absolutely randomly from them, the general idea is that these things will be memorable. They're long, but they're going to be easier to type because you're typing familiar language. So you can learn to memorize them, but because they're automatically generated or not generated by a human process, they're going to have the right randomness properties. And then pronounceable passwords, they just create strings that kind of look like your target language. They're things that could be used if you have to read a password over the phone. So, for example, all of my security questions for, when a bank says, what's your dog's, what was your first pet's name? I use a pronounceable generator for those, thinking that there might be some instance where I need to read them over the phone. Obviously, I don't use my first pet's name because that's not really all that secret. Okay, when talking about target language, I'm an American, therefore I'm exceedingly provincial, and I have no awareness that the rest of the world exists. And as such, I'm going to be talking about English, which actually works out to be a good thing because English helps illustrate some of the problems that we wouldn't have in pronounceable generators if we were, say, looking at Japanese, which has this really nice, simple syllable structure. Okay. Now, for Diceware-like schemes, or word lists, ST has 248 words in their list. The original Diceware scheme has 7776. Neither of those are arbitrary. The word list that we've been putting together over the last couple months is sitting at around 18,000 English words, all 8 or fewer characters, and trying to be relatively familiar, not too many obscure words showing up in there. The average length of each word is quite a bit longer than we find with SQ or Diceware. That'll come up in a bit. But now going back to syllables, because I didn't really put my slides in a reasonable order. Going back to syllables, we've got 4 difficulties. Some are more pronounced in English than others. Spelling and pronunciation in English is, not all that cohesive. Some syllables are far more common than others. A syllable like T will show up in words far more often than a syllable like strengths. Strengths is a single syllable. It's possible in English, but you don't find lots of syllables of that form. I'll skip the bit about the actual complications of syllable structure. What goes at the end of a syllable can depend on what precedes it. So now, just sticking with writing, spool is certainly a possible written syllable in English. It's an actual word. Spole is a possible word, but isn't an actual word. But you would never see anything like S-P-O-O-L-L. It's just not the kind of thing you would see in written English. So we have these sorts of dependencies. Now, we can avoid the first problem, the thing about the difference between spelling and pronunciation, by only caring about spelling. If we're not actually, simply because we're presenting people with written texts, written words, we don't actually have to care what the underlying phonology is behind these structures. We can just look at structures of written words and base our system off of that. And because I'm no longer a student in linguistics, I don't actually have to worry about getting everything right. It's fine if I approximate, or if we approximate and miss certain special cases of syllable structures, or get some things that actually aren't possible. Because I'm not trying to provide an exact description of what's a possible syllable in English. I'm trying to get something that works for a pronounceable password generator. The more difficult problems, and now what most pronounceable generators have done in the past when dealing with the issue of some syllables being more likely than others is that they've simply generated they've made their generator mimic that. They produce more syllables like T than syllables like strength. They simply bias their generators to mimic frequencies in English. To deal with things like that S-P-O-O-L-L case, sometimes they will generate and then filter out things that don't look right. So they've got a system of generating, possibly through a finite state machine, possibly through probabilistic phrase structure rules, possibly just a mixture of these things added in hodgepodge, and also some filters on these things. So that's how most have done it so far. And FIPS 181 is a NIST recommendation, and that is extremely common and used all over the place. PW01 is a bit less biased. They're focusing more on the SPOOL, the context dependency issue, than the frequency issue. And a bunch of others use FIPS. One uses a Markov model based on spellings. So all of these deliberately, as a matter of design, produce non-uniform output. Some generated passwords are going to be more likely than other generated passwords from the system. And as I argued in a talk that I'm sure nobody wants me to repeat 2 years ago here, when you have a password creation scheme that is not uniform, you should be looking at the mean entropy. You should be looking at the probability of getting the most likely generated password for judging what that scheme is. So these systems that are deliberately non-uniform are weak. The problem is that they're a pain to analyze. They're typically hodgepodges of different rules stuck together, and so it's actually very difficult to even figure out how strong they are. And I seem to have talked ahead of this slide. So yes, we should be using the min entropy. That is, we should be looking at the likelihood of getting the most common password, and we can analyze them. Now, creating a uniform scheme is really easy. You just take the kind of consonants that can be at the beginning of a syllable by looking at a whole bunch of words. Take the kinds of strings of vowels that can be in the middle, and the kinds of consonants run together, consonant clusters that can be at the end, and you just pick from each column and stick them together. The stuff at the beginning is called an onset. The nucleus of the syllable is the vowel stuff. And again, I'm talking about English. We're not talking about Serbo-Croatian, in which R can be a word like grum can be a syllable, or even the second syllable of bottle in English just has an L. But we're talking about spelling here anyway. And I've gone way off track. Anyway, so you've got these three parts. You stick them together, and that first part, the onset, and also the coda, can be null. These can be empty strings, but we need to treat them as we would treat any other consonant cluster that can go at the beginning or the end of a syllable, because even though, okay, let me just read what we've got here. A large portion of actual syllables in actual English have either an empty onset or an empty coda, but we must use str as an onset as often as we use the empty string in order to get a uniform distribution. And likewise, we have to use str as often as we use something like t. And so, although English naturally biases towards lighter syllables, our system, in its uniformality, will actually produce mostly very heavy syllables. So with this brain-dead uniform generator, picking commonish onsets and nuclei and codas, I've got something that produces about 15.5 bits per syllable, but the results really aren't very English-like. Here I've used space as a separator, and these are not cherry-picked examples for this talk. I simply ran the thing a few times, for different lengths and pasted in what I got. So for example, in that first one, SPOOSS is one of these things that actually violates the typical rules of English. You would not find a word like that. The same with the second word in that first example, which is not even clear how you would pronounce it. Some cases we get things that actually are words, like whom and creek, and some cases we get words, things that are close to words that maybe not everybody's happy with for their passwords, or maybe they are, like porn. And I really, really hope that if anybody's just listening to the audio of this, that they actually look at the slide and realize that these were non-cherry-picked examples. Now, with word lists, here, all of these things actually are words of English, 8 characters or less. And you see the kinds of things that we get. Some actually come out like they can almost be meaningful expressions. Even that 6-word thing at the end. What is it? Seize, manner, witchery, unarmed John fourfold. I don't know. I mean, so one thing that we've got to be concerned about is nasty meanings, because of course our usage would be to be recommending master passwords to users and saying, you know, we're trying to get away from users making up their own master passwords, which are going to be inherently weak. And so, so we run the risk of insulting people, offending people. We've already removed taboo words from the list. Nonsense words can already seen this with the syllable generated nonsense. Words can sometimes be words and sometimes be things that are a problem. And now everybody in this room will understand when you're presented with random stuff, that it's random. The machine isn't trying to tell you something. But again, we are, our audience is not the people in this room, though we hope you'll still use the system. It's for a lot of people who don't understand randomness. Okay, in comparing the word lists in that particular pronounceable generator, we get a few more bits per character and a few more bits per unit from the pronounceable generator. And so, including the separator, if you want a password that gets you to at least 40 bits, you need to use at least 3 units of both. But it's going to be, on average, 2 characters longer with the words than with the syllable generator, and you're going to, and that's going to increase as you increase the length. And again, we are concerned. One of the limiting factors is what somebody is willing to type in as a master password on a mobile device. Neither of these are great in terms of typing in on a mobile device. The syllable ones is a little bit better. And in other things, we expect that the meaningfulness of the word list is going to make these things easier to memorize and learn and recall over a longer term. Suspect that typing familiar words on a full-length keyboard is going to be quicker than typing nonsense words on a full-length keyboard. typing, the shorter things are going to be easier on a mobile keyboard than on a full keyboard, and we're more likely to encounter nasty meanings with the real word list. Now, all of that is speculation. But what I would love to see is actual solid research by people who study usability in exactly in this kind of stuff. And I talked ahead of my slides. So yeah, we just need to start experimenting on people. I mean, that seems like a natural thing to do. It's easy for us to speculate about these things, but we need to follow it up with actual data on what people do. And we also need to remember that we're pushing one edge of the problem. We are working to make passwords, the password that somebody has to keep in their head, stronger. While something like slow hashing, like Argon2 or PBKDF2, is designed to make those more computationally expensive to guess, which is kind of pulling down from the other end. But I don't think we're going to get those to meet. And I suspect from reading the abstract of Cormac's talk later this afternoon that he's going to be talking about that, but that's just a guess. But I certainly look forward to that. And this is me. I'm Jeffery Goldberg. I'll be here through Thursday, leaving Friday, so I'm not here for DEF CON. On Twitter, JP Goldberg, Jeff at agilebits.com, and I post a lot about security matters and cryptography on the Agile Bits blog. And are there any questions? Okay, way there. Oh, hey.
Microphone, Steve, microphone. Please.
What is the minimum?
Oh.
Turn it on.
Good sound.
Okay. What is the minimum length for the dictionary that you came up with?
Oh, sorry, the minimum.
Repeat the question.
Yes, okay, so the question was, what is the minimum length of the dictionary? Do you mean the minimal length of items in the dictionary? In all of them, it's 1. You're concerned about, let's say you pick a let's say a 4-word password and they're all 1-letter words, so you're getting 4 plus the separator is 7, you're getting a 7-character password. Yeah, that's a concern. That's bad. I don't know what to do about it at this point. I mean, there are things that I can do about it, but I've left that out here because they just make things.
Just removing anything less than 4 characters.
Right, so that will up the length of the passwords that people end up having to type in. A lot.
Isn't that the point?
Is it going after length or is it going after strength? That is this. I mean, length, if people just type in 20 ones, that's not really a very strong password. And as I've argued before, the strength of a password scheme depends, the strength of a password from a scheme depends on the scheme that it's generated from. And we should always assume that the attacker knows how the user generated the password. In particular, if we are going to generate passwords for people to use, we have to assume that the attacker knows how we're generating those passwords. So length isn't the only thing.
it was kind of adding to that. It was kind of cool when we had a LinkedIn breach in 2012. After that, I think the paper was released by Carnegie Mellon in 2013. Carnegie Mellon, they actually created a passphrase generator that created English grammatically correct sentences as candidates for passphrases. And using that, Carnegie Mellon actually were able to crack passphrases from the LinkedIn breach that nobody else, including Jeremy Gosling, hadn't been able to crack so far. And it was just grammatically correct English sentences, which was, to me, was awesome when they came out with the paper. That was really impressive.
Right. So if you're restricting it to a scheme of the grammar of English, then again you assume that that's known by the attacker. So the idea of a scheme like this is you're actually picking each element at random uniformly.
I've got an idea that may enable the usability to improve. Given that users will likely remember the phonetic pronunciation of the passphrases rather than the spelling, maybe it'll make it simpler for them to spell things incorrectly yet still use it as a valid password by generating permutations of whatever they enter, replacing something they would pay in 1 hour, 2 hours, and so on, so that you can verify whether one of maybe 25 possible passwords based on the one they entered is the correct one.
Okay, so I'm going to try to repeat the question. The idea is that since people, particularly if you're using nonsense words, will be remembering the pronunciation and not necessarily the spelling, your verifier should look at equivalences. So if you've got a password or a nonsense word that ends in the letter C, you might allow them to also put in the letter K. It's kind of like the scheme that Facebook uses with caps lock. If you type in your password wrong and they get a failure, they will then go and try it again as if you have a caps lock key on. It doesn't actually weaken the password. It does make that login attempt a bit longer for you. And so a scheme like that might be useful.
Feel free to use it.
Thanks.
So, so you're, I guess, simultaneously trying to optimize two competing things. So you're trying to, one, have a password be memorizable and memorable by a human and easily typable on a mobile device and a laptop, right? But you're also trying to pack as much information into as few characters as possible. And so those two things can conflict. I was going to suggest something like what Per mentioned, where you abandon one of them. And so we don't want to abandon the security, maybe we abandon, say, the length, where we try to pack it all into as small a space as possible. And so you can still use a Diceware-like strategy where you pick words out of a list, or even maybe syllables out of syllables generated in some way, but you can generate, long sentences where you have a 10,000 word list of nouns and a 10,000 word list of verbs and adjectives and that sort of thing. And you string it together with actual punctuation and capitalization for nouns and all of that. And so you can still measure the amount of entropy that you're getting. Or it's log base 2 of 10,000 for your nouns and log base whatever for your other words. And so you can still say with certainty that your sentence, granted it'll be a long sentence, has, say, 64 bits or 56 bits, whatever your target entropy is, but you no longer are trying to pack it all into just 30 characters or 40 characters. And I would like to see an approach like that, because that's easier for people to memorize and understand and type. And it sort of abandons the notion that passwords are short.
And I mean, if we were not constrained by people entering these things in on mobile devices, something like that. Was everybody able to hear that question? Good. Okay. Then something like that makes sense. There are a couple difficulties in that. For example, you'd have to make either all your verbs transitive verbs or all your verbs intransitive verbs. Otherwise, you'll get uneven uneven distributions because you'll be using a more complex phrase structure grammar. And so you're going to end up shortening some of your lists that way.
Yeah, you can definitely reduce entropy, especially if you want to ensure that there's an absolutely grammatically correct sentence. So probably you'll choose at random, then you'll have to permute your choices a little bit to make it all work. And in the process of permuting your choices, you're reducing a few bits. So then you could, over-generate, say, generate a 72-bit password, where the maximum reduction of bits across all your permutations they get you grammatically correct only reduces it by, say, 12 bits, and you get your target of 6%.
Well, yeah, if you know that you're only reducing it by some fixed amount, but it's nicer to do something that will generate uniform from the beginning, which means you have to use the, in a sense, you have to not have state in your generator. That is, what you do after a verb shouldn't depend on whether it was a transitive verb or an intransitive verb. I mean, there are ways of doing this, but I mean, that's just a grammatical aside. I'd love that. I just don't foresee us, I mean, for our usage, the huge limitation is typability on mobile.
You two guys are sitting for lunch. This stuff can be so easily fixed if somebody can just do the friggin' Kickstarter for Unicode 7 keyboard. Somebody, please. More questions.
I just have a few questions.
Same questions.
We've primarily been talking about English words or gibberish words. Have you thought about, or has anybody thought about passphrases that incorporated words from different languages? Maybe my passphrase has an Arabic word, an Italian word, an English word, and so on and so on. And how would that factor into translate into the bit?
That's something that I looked at a couple of years ago when I was first looking at how to expand our word list. One of the difficulties is that doubling this word list, 18,000 by adding another 18,000 from another language, is adding now just one bit per word that you get. So the question is exactly how much you get from that and where you are and whether it turns out to be worth it. And just back to Per's comment about UTF, you not only need to have everyone deal with UTF, you need to use exactly the same normalization. An acute accent E can be represented by different byte states in UTF. So we need to normalize that. But
I do my phrases in Norwegian, so you can try to guess mine. Yes.
This might be up your alley as well, Eric. Since you were saying that one of the major problems you were pointing out is that on the mobile device, it's very difficult to enter a wrong key or just annoying. I'm curious what your position is now on technologies like Touch ID, and I'm curious to see what Per thinks too, because I know Per really hates biometric security. And do you see that as a reasonable way around this on the mobile device? I've provided similar technology to users, and I'm skeptical. I don't know how well it'll work. It's like here's the rope hang or something. So I'm curious, where's your position on that?
I was sitting with Jeff last night, and Adam called it as well. And one of the things we discussed is, the announcement from Apple now moving from a minimum 4 to minimum 6 digits in your PIN code, starting with iOS 9.
Yeah.
And my initial thought about that, it's a good thing to do, of course, but my initial thought is that, well, because I have tons of people coming up to me like, haha, sucker, try to get access to my phone because I'm using Touch ID. And I'll just, do the 3 failed attempts, and then I will tell them, well, I have a Markov table on, the most popular 4-digit PIN codes. And that is, my chances of guessing your 4-digit PIN code is actually pretty good. So I think my theory is that Apple are moving to 6 digits, basically because they have seen, maybe they have done research asking people, do you still use a 4-digit PIN code even though you are using Touch ID the entire time? Because if you are using Touch ID all the time, I can't really see the point of just having a 4-digit PIN code. Then I would strongly recommend you to have a much longer PIN code or eventually a password set. So you only have to type that in once every time you eventually turn off and turn back on your iOS device.
Except that Apple, I mean, as far as I understand, and I think this is actually pretty clear from their public announcements, they introduced Touch ID to get people to use PIN codes at all. They had a huge problem of people not using any PIN codes. And that, as far as I understand, was the primary motivation for Touch ID. Yes, using something like Touch ID reduces the, or some second factor kind of thing, definitely reduces how often somebody needs to key in a master password, and it's a tough thing for us. We actually do make use of, on iOS, of storing a master password equivalent that people can unlock with Touch ID. But we've got this whole set of basically guesses at what parameters to set for that. How often should that be cleared? How often should we force people to use their master password, not only so that they don't forget it, but so that this thing isn't sitting around in dangerous places and dangerous times too long, while at the same time using it to encourage them to use stronger master passwords. So yeah, no, this is definitely part of it. And if we could have some kind of second factor mechanism, but for decryption that would be easy for users to use across all of their devices on which they use 1Password, that would just be fantastic. But there's nothing that is sufficiently easy for everyone to use across all their devices.
Last question from Thomas.
You've been waiting.
Okay, yeah.
There is wanted to clarify how you measure entropy of dictionary generators versus and whether it is how accurate the entropy metrics are, and whether it is possible to use some well-crafted dictionary that would fool your entropy.
Because we're picking each word from the dictionary with equal probability as any other word in any circumstance, the calculation of the entropy measure is really simple. It's simply the base 2 logarithm of the number of items in that dictionary. So because it works by pulling a uniform distribution, that calculation is easy. Notice I did not.
You may have some collisions. If words are short, you may have a large number of collisions of different word sequences matching, producing the same.
Okay, prefixing issues. Yeah, this is something that we looked at. So, for example, we could have the word blue in our dictionary, and we could have the word bird in our dictionary, and we could also have the word bluebird in our dictionary. And thus, there would be multiple ways of getting the string bluebird. That's a problem. I've simply taken the simple expediency of saying that we would enforce a separator between units, because when I tried to pare down the list to avoid that problem, it was becoming too much of a pain. So yes, that's a very interesting and real problem, and I sidestepped it by simply saying, we're going to have separators between these units.
Okay, understood.
Okay, thank you.
Last one from Cormac.
Just I have no insight whatsoever into why Apple went before 6 digits, but there was one good, interesting study about 5 years ago on the influence of the second factor on a user chosen first factor. It was basically once you get the second factor, there was a noticeable weaker grammar than things that they chose. You know, they kind of seem to assume that, oh, I don't worry about it so much now.
Yeah, so for those who didn't hear the question, is that if you give people a second factor, a true second factor system, they tend to be less careful about their primary, the one that's on their choice, their passwords. And yeah, no, so this is actually something that we worry about. If we introduce a second factor, it has to work very, very well. With Apple's Touch ID, the Touch ID is not a second factor, it's an alternative. And so it's that sometimes you use your passcode, sometimes you use your finger. But you're never in a situation where you're using both in combination. And so since it's an alternative that allows you to use the passcode less frequently, or in our case, since it's an alternative that allows you to use your master password less frequently, we don't have any data from our users other than what they explicitly come and report to us. But a lot of people have said, hey, now that you've got this Touch ID unlock, for many cases, I can use a stronger master password. But of course, those are the users we're hearing about. We've got no data.
Time's up. Now it's time for lunch, and we will be back here in the room. Next speaker up is Cormac Ehrlich from Microsoft Research. At 2 o'clock, enjoy lunch inside the chill-out zone. Welcome back, and thank you to Jeff.